Over 40 months into Russia's war against Ukraine, we'll now assess the military situation today. I'm Julian Röpke, and this is Build Situation Room. And we start with disturbing images of the massive Russian missile attack on the Ukrainian metropolis of Dnipro. Yesterday, 17 dead, more than 200 injured. That's the outcome, the result of the Russian terror attack, as we'll see shortly. It primarily targeted civilians. We're looking at the footage and first see a car that was nearby when one of the ballistic missiles, specifically Iskander-M missiles, medium-range ballistic weapons, struck the area that were deployed here. And we can already see here. What we see on the left are essentially overhead lines for railways, and this entire region was directly impacted by the strike, around the train station of the city, where trains were passing through just as the train from Odessa arrived, which was supposed to head to Zaporizhzhia, passed by the Dnipro, and then, fully loaded, was hit, at least very close to the impact near this ballistic missile. We'll now see the time around 11:05 a.m. Here it is, 11:05 a.m. in the morning when the strike occurred. And now we're about to see footage from the train which will show us with what force, with what truly horrific brutality the Russians have struck here. This is a woman who recorded a video simply because she had to wait. The train stopped due to the missile alarm. People then thought, well, this might take a while, but then we'll be able to get out again. But we'll see that shortly. We'll also need to pixelate some parts, the really disturbing footage that was published by this woman through her own social media account. She is also injured here now and bleeding, and now we're seeing here, this is what the train looked like afterward. So there were many, many injured here. They're talking about over 100 injured, but also what we haven't shown yet, rockets have hit near schools and kindergartens. Here as well, we're currently seeing the footage, or at least we did manage to catch it yesterday. Now let's take a closer look at this entire area where these people were actually struck. The train, you can see it relatively well here. There were also men on board, but typically in Ukraine, due to the war, where the men are mostly at the front, there were mostly women and children on the train, which we'll see now. And it's just like so often, the Russians didn't specifically aim their attack directly at the train. But it doesn't matter at all because they hit the train. Here we see the target because of the large factory behind it, and we can still see the smoke rising. We also see the destroyed steel here. Only the Russians, well, they just don't care at all. They target factories located right next to railway tracks where civilian trains are operating. And therefore, yesterday, it hit this train here. So we can see here again the destruction behind it. We also see another smoke cloud here and can clearly observe that it was multiple rockets that struck this factory compound directly. And in front of the train, and I hope you can see it here, practically every window has been shattered. The sheer force, the massive and devastating impact of this huge Iskander-M missile tore through the entire train, injuring and killing the people inside. And here we see children everywhere standing in between, school kids or with backpacks and bags. And this is yet another deeply tragic and devastating day for Ukraine. Dnipro, a bustling metropolis of millions, has just been brutally attacked by the Russians, and as mentioned, over 220 dead and injured combined. We are moving a bit east from Dnipro to the Donetsk region. There, the Russian army has managed to capture another town located right on the border between the Donetsk and Dnipropetrovsk regions. And we'll now take a look at these recordings. We're talking about Novosahivka, another town, as mentioned, just a few kilometers away. From the regional boundary line, we can clearly observe 2 Russian soldiers raising or letting the flag wave freely in the town's central area. And what we're seeing now are essentially the attacks to advance further east, to move westward within the town, and to get closer to the regional border. From a drone's perspective, we can see it's yet another very small village. Here we see it. Essentially just a single street lined with houses on both sides, nothing more than that at all, really. And now we see how this place from the center, which was already under Russian control, is now being attacked and pushed even further towards the western side. And well, one really has to acknowledge by Ukrainian soldiers, so to speak. Right now we're seeing the drone attacks, which are quite typical, and then shortly after we'll also catch sight of the Russian infantry who are advancing within the town and further establishing their foothold in both the eastern and western parts of the town. Interestingly, we are about to see footage that, according to Russian information, shows where the Ukrainians are positioned. Specifically here we see these multiple rocket launchers striking, which is extremely unfortunate. Once again, it seems the Ukrainians are likely in this wooded area. And right behind it, here we see it. This is the oblast border. That means there is already Dnipropetrovsk in the center of the country, or a central Ukrainian region without borders with Russia, with real Russia, of course, and now we see these impacts left and right of it. This suggests the Ukrainians have withdrawn westward, now positioned directly next to the town. and the Russians are now advancing further inside the town. We've seen some attacks on Ukrainian soldiers where, fortunately, the impacts aren't directly visible. However, we can see that they've managed to push forward. And here we see them. These are the Russian soldiers now at the far west, the absolute western edge of the small village Novosahivka, clearing out the last remaining Ukrainian positions. And according to our information, it unfolded in such a way that ultimately this location was completely taken over by the Russian army. Let's take a look at this on the map to see why this location was, in fact, another border town, so to speak, between Donetsk and Dnipropetrovsk. We're zooming into the Pokrovsk region, a city that Russia has been consistently and persistently trying to control since last year. They haven't managed to do that, and instead they took the alternative, which was to push further west, advancing toward Dnipropetrovsk. And we can see here on the map that it hasn't been updated yet, so Novosahivka, you can see it under this square here, that's the dark gray area. That is practically completely under Russian control now, and we can see that the Ukrainians had withdrawn, and that was visible here, meaning directly to the oblast border. That means we assume that Novosahivka is now completely under Russian control, and that the length of the front, so to speak, along the oblast border thereby becomes even several kilometers longer. That means the Russians essentially face the challenging decision of where they can make their next advance, precisely against only where Padlivka lies, next to the small town of Meshchova, which are actually situated here in Dnipropetrovsk. We see the front is getting longer and longer. One could advance from the south, one could advance from the east. And that, of course, is a huge problem for the Ukrainian army, which now has more and more to defend practically in the center of the country. We're staying in the Donetsk region, moving a bit further north to the area around the city of Lyman. And here we have new footage showing that Ukraine is now capable of destroying multiple rocket launchers of the Russian army using FPV drones. We've just seen also in Novosahivka one of these multiple rocket launchers in action, bombarding the retreating Ukrainian soldiers there. Now, as mentioned, a bit further north we see another one. Here we see it, the BM-21. Grad launcher firing its rockets. Is firing, I believe, just 4, which you can see here now. 1, 2, 3, 4. They and the Ukrainians assume that more missiles are still inside here. Up to 40 it can carry. Here, you can see it relatively well once more, just the next shot that's being prepared. We also see infantrymen of the Russian army moving away here, essentially preparing themselves for this next shot. And now, as we observe, the approach begins to unfold of the Ukrainian drone. And it's a fiberglass drone, as you can relatively well see. Right now, we don't have any static, we don't have any interference with the radio signals, but we have that very, very clear signal that's maintained all the way down to the ground. And it clearly shows, even as we near the horizon or the ground, the signal doesn't degrade at all. We're dealing with a fiber optic guided drone here. And now you can see how some of the Russian soldiers are running away. They've essentially heard or seen the drone and are now trying to get away. And the interesting thing here, which we're seeing for the first time, is that a fiber optic drone with a cable trailing behind it can fly just as far as a grenade launcher can shoot. We'll check this on the map shortly to see just how far Ukrainian fiber optic drones are now capable of flying. So here is the direct attack. We can see it now. A total of 40 rockets are possible. Once again, the Russians are trying to protect themselves from drones, as we can see here above, but only from FPV radio-controlled or radio-guided drones, which essentially would attack from an angle above, so that they come very close to the ground. This drone here, however, is fiberglass guided and can therefore fly very low. And here we witness the massive explosion of this Grad launcher, ensuring it is completely unusable for the Russian army from this moment onward. This, as mentioned, is a novelty for the first time that Ukrainians are using fiber-guided drones against multiple rocket launchers. And we also see that they are evolving. They are trying to adapt to the Russians in this style of warfare and are also able to keep shooting with it continuously. We also know exactly where it all happened. It was by some experts who do this every day. Geolocated, as it is called, and then also published on the social network X. And we know that the attack took place exactly at Shturov, located directly to the north of Crimea. This specific area, I believe, was already seized by the Russian army back in 2022 during the summer months of that same year. Here's the larger Ukrainian city of Lyman. The front line is also clearly visible now. Based on this front line, we can see that we have, at the very least, 10 kilometers, probably more like 12 kilometers, to the next Ukrainian position, from where this fiber optic drone could have been launched in order to successfully reach Shidlivka. This demonstrates that the Russians, who with their, perhaps we can switch to a different color like white, have a maximum range of only 20 kilometers in this scenario. That's the maximum range a BM-21 can fire, so they have to stay quite close to the front. that they are no longer secure in the manner they operate and now find themselves in a position where they are, or rather must expose themselves to the risk of being hit by fiber optic drones. Another video we want to take a look at shows just how incredibly difficult it is for the Russian army, or really for any soldiers, to protect themselves against drones, specifically those with thermal vision. As we know, both the Ukrainians and the Russians are deploying drones with thermal or heat-seeking vision, which essentially distinguish not between silhouettes as we do, but rather between different heat signatures. And we are about to witness the absolute challenge here, namely, these heat signatures essentially reveal themselves quite clearly even in the middle of the night on a vast open meadow. What would otherwise be completely invisible, how people are moving from point A to point B. So we can clearly observe here 3 Russian infantrymen moving to the left, who have now been spotted and are actively being tracked by this drone. And now it gets interesting. The Russians believe they have a way to defend against it, to make themselves invisible, so to speak, from the drone. You've likely heard them flying overhead, but most likely haven't seen them. We're in the night, and now we've got these big coats that they practically unwrap and drape over themselves, which are actually quite cool to wear. So they don't emit that heat signature like humans naturally tend to do. Here we see it once again clearly. The problem is only for the Russians. Now they've realized the issue for the Russians is these coats they're throwing on, like foil or something similar, to cover themselves. So cold that it's still very easy for the drone to spot them because they're colder than the surroundings. That means we saw it very clearly how the Russians just threw those coats over themselves and now are extremely easy for the drone to target because they're not at all invisible, making them stand out. But since they're now significantly colder than their surroundings, they've become an especially easy and obvious target for the Ukrainian drone operators. What is she doing now? She's dropping her grenades here, and at that moment we also have to pixelate the whole thing. Here we see it. The 3 Russians carry a huge amount of ammunition, as we'll soon witness. So we have at most 2 small grenades being thrown at them, but we're seeing massive secondary explosions. So we're seeing practically all the ammunition that these 3 were carrying exploding repeatedly. And thus it turns out to be fatal for the 3 Russian soldiers. This whole situation shows us once again just how incredibly difficult it is, and how incredibly indifferent the Russians ultimately are to the whole thing. At least the Russian officers, they just keep sending them regardless. Probably these very low-cost, untrained, recently recruited volunteers, one still has to send them straight to the front lines just to carry ammunition and support the troops. The Ukrainians refer to them as mules or pack donkeys, which is, of course, a demeaning and disrespectful term. Still, that's what the Ukrainian army calls them, I was told myself. And the whole thing once again highlights just how relatively brief the lifespan of a cargo drone, if you will, truly tends to be, which is used at the front solely to transport ammunition and supplies from point A to point B. From Donetsk in the east of the country, we move to Sumy in the northeast. There too, the Russian army continues to push forward. Yet, according to Ukrainian reports, they've managed to halt the advance here. And it also seems, judging by recent footage, that a small town, specifically Andriivka, has been successfully recaptured by the Ukrainian forces. We're looking at new footage that shows how the Russians are trying, after the Ukrainians recaptured Andriivka, to bring this area back under their control. These are recordings from the neighboring village of Oleksivka, and they show us exactly what Mr. Zelensky and others have repeatedly explained. In Sumy, the Russian army relies solely on light infantry, not at all on tanks. So far, only 4 armored vehicles have been destroyed during the entire offensive. And otherwise, as we can see here, it's almost exclusively infantrymen on motorcycles. Here we see them. These are the motorcycles that are now supposed to move from Oleksivka along the only road to Andriivka to retake this location. However, the Russians' most significant problem is that they were already spotted while on their way. Here we see how many there are. It continues to the left. I hope it's visible now. Exactly. So there are more and more. At least 8 motorcycles riding in a line, heading towards the neighboring town. However, they are advancing directly into the relatively well-prepared defensive positions of the Ukrainians, who are now targeting this group with a combination of drones and mines. As we'll see on the map shortly, it's actually only about 2 to 3 kilometers separating these 2 specific locations. The whole thing ends here absolutely fatally for all deployed Russians, and we have to keep pixelating various spots because of the new infantrymen in the Russian army, probably not a single one survives. The upcoming scene in this footage from the Ukrainian armed forces is rather interesting and shows us a somewhat new approach by the Russian forces on how they plan to advance. It seems that the Russians managed to spot the mines on the street, effectively blocking their attack route. What we can now observe is an approaching Russian drone clearing these mines. Here we see a clearly prepared minefield with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, making a total of 10 mines arranged in 2 distinct rows, effectively blocking this entire section of the road ahead for any potential movement or passage. The drone lunges into the mines, and due to the power of the primary explosion, the mines nearby explode as well, thus clearing the way for the advance. As we continue, we have to pixelate the whole thing because over time, we see that more and more of the motorcycles and also more and more of the infantrymen here are being stopped and indeed killed by the Ukrainian army. However, the whole thing clearly shows what we've said and what Ukraine has been stating as well. Andriivka has also been successfully recaptured and is no longer under Russian control. They tried using these roughly 9 motorized infantrymen, so very, very, very lightly mechanized infantry, to regain control of this location. Let's look at the whole situation on the map to understand that the Russian offensive has, at least for now, been halted in Sumy. What we just saw were, as I mentioned earlier, the video footage captured in Oleksivka. That's this small town, which is under Russian control here, visible in this area. And the primary objective of the Russian assault was Andriivka, which was successfully recaptured by Ukrainian forces. And we just saw it. All the footage we just watched comes from just those 2 kilometers. However, that was enough. That stretch was dangerous and deadly enough for the Russian soldiers, leading to them being taken out one after the other. And we can see here, the map hasn't changed significantly. We know the Russians advanced in that area, essentially launching their offensive a few months ago, and they've managed to push forward up to 10 kilometers. In this area, their advance was halted. Over the past 4 weeks, the front has remained largely unchanged, except for Ukraine retaking one village. At this moment, it appears that the Ukrainian army could potentially manage to successfully halt the Russian advance in the direction of Sumy. Down here, about 30 kilometers from the border, it seems the Ukrainian army might currently be able to stop this advance. We want to watch another video that shows how important it is for the Ukrainians to equip the costly, very modern air defense systems of the Russian army. Here's some fresh footage that shows a Buk M3 system being directly targeted in an attack. A very costly and advanced system priced at around 45 million euros. And now we see here how 2 very small kamikaze drones are flying directly towards it and successfully making impact. However, what we also see is that the damage is relatively minor, so we don't have a complete explosion now because specifically the radar unit is being targeted. The damage appears minor, but it could actually be quite significant as the focus is consistently on the radar system on this side, which doesn't lead to a large explosion. There's no fuel or explosives or anything like that in there, but they're trying to disable the radar by repeatedly flying towards it. From the surveillance drone's perspective, we're now witnessing a small yet highly precise explosion exactly at the spot where it was intended to hit. In order to inflict sensitive damage to the Russian radar system, soon we'll see a second attack, meaning the Ukrainians have also managed to strike the system from the other side, so to speak, twice now. And here as well, the video quality is truly excellent, so we can confidently say that the Ukrainian drones have struck here and accurately hit the exact target they were intended to. Here again, the impact from another perspective. This means it's highly likely that the Ukrainians succeeded in taking out yet another 45 million euro system, which as a result is blind on one side, meaning it can no longer see what Ukraine is doing, and also it can no longer fire its rockets in a targeted or precise manner at the Ukrainian drones or aircraft nearby. And in that sense, this destruction also makes Ukraine a bit safer. Finally, we want to take a look at footage we've never seen before, namely from an F-16. Of the Ukrainian Air Force. We do know that Ukraine has received a number of F-16s. The actual number is classified. We do know that overall there will be more than 70 aircraft arriving gradually over time. And we can see here how these F-16s are being deployed, that is only partly for offensive operations. Most of them, according to our information, are being used to take down these Shahed drones, these large kamikaze drones of the Russian army from the sky. And for now, these are just points that we need to analyze. It will become much clearer in just a moment or so here. This here is one of those Shahed 136 or Jaren 2 drones that's moving across Ukraine, flying at around 200 to 300 kilometers per hour. And right here, that's the Ukrainian F-16 launching an attack on the Shahed drone, with the entire scene being filmed by a civilian bystander nearby. Now we're witnessing the exact moment a Sidewinder missile is launched. I hope you can see that back here. So you can kind of spot the ejection there, I think, the missile as it's just flying. And just seconds later, the massive explosion here in the sky. That means the Sidewinder missile strikes the Shahed drone, the F-16 pulls away, and thus a major part of the threat from this drone is effectively neutralized, with the exception of the falling debris here, has now been successfully averted. Ukraine continues to undertake these operations daily, as mentioned, but not nearly on the scale required to effectively eliminate all the drones. We know that Russia is now using at least 200 of these Shahed drones per night, sometimes even 400 drones, and Ukraine naturally needs from us Western countries, especially from Germany, much more air defense, much more. Resources, financial resources to address this major threat that looms over Ukraine every night and every day, to better intercept it, to fully stop it.